Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We begin by continuing with Dr. He, as new evidence has come out on his actions when he edited the genome of babies in China. The CRISPR babies, as they are known, were meant to be edited to be resistant to HIV. Examining the work of Dr. He, experts disagree that this is what has happened, and likely it has made them more vulnerable. That's not the only problem. Last week he got in trouble when one of his articles was retracted due to the conflict of interest. And this week, evidence has come out that at least 3 government agencies knew about his work and provided funding, something the Chinese government has denied strenuously. While the evidence itself has yet to come out in full detail, at least one news site is reporting that they have seen the documents in question. They indicate that the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology, the Shenzhen Science and Technology Innovation Commission, and the university from which he operated, Southern University of Science and Technology, provided funding for his research, knowing what he was meant to be doing. This is directly contrary to their claims that what Dr. He did was done without their knowledge, support, or facilities. At least some of this comes about from slides used for presentations and other publications in progress, in which their logos and similar appear, indicating that they gave funding and support to the project. This is standard practice when you use money from research grants. You indicate where it came from and who has supported you. It is possible that Dr. He used money from these grants that was left over. This is still a common practice, where a project may overestimate what it needs to be completed. The money left over is used to begin a new project, and that may be the case here. Although not necessarily common, it is not uncommon either. Speaking of bizarre genetic occurrences, twins have been born in Australia that have semi-identical DNA. They are only the second case to have been discovered. Normally, twins are either identical or not identical. In the case of identical twins, one sperm comes into contact with one egg. This later divides into 2 embryos. Alternatively, 2 sperm can come into contact with 2 eggs and fertilize them, creating 2 distinct embryos. In this case, one egg was fertilized by 2 sperm, and then that egg divided into 2 embryos. The reason we know this is how the embryos developed. Originally, there was only a single placenta. This would indicate identical twins. Later, they found that it was a male and female. This is not something that occurs with identical twins, which is rather obvious from the name identical. In this case, they are instead something called sesquizygotic. That means that the genome was divided between the 2, and they've each taken a different developmental path. They have a 100% identical match of the maternal DNA, but the paternal DNA is slightly different, and this is how we know it was 2 sperm and 1 egg. Although unlikely to create any medical problems in the future, it is a curious case. Speaking of curiosity, NASA's Mars rover Curiosity entered safe mode in the last few weeks. This comes shortly on the heels of Opportunity being declared dead. Although NASA is uncertain as to what has happened, they have decided to halt any further research on Mars using Curiosity while they download the memory logs. This means that at least for the next few weeks, there will be no more research done by Curiosity on Mars. In other news and current affairs, Project Veritas has come out with a whistleblower claiming Facebook suppresses conservative political views. This is not a particularly new claim, as it has been brought out before by different groups. In the past, Facebook has privately settled lawsuits brought against them by such conservative voices. Project Veritas relies on a former insider, who was a contractor at Facebook who was fired about a year ago. They claim that Facebook engineers have a plan to demote what they consider bad content. This broadly covers conservative users of the Facebook system. Facebook considers people as trolls when they use certain words, and they then effectively punish them by limiting their reach and blocking certain actions, such as comments. Facebook considers these as hateful content and a breach of their terms of service, this being something of an irony. They also have what they call special features which are triggered before important occasions, such as the elections. This goes contrary to the argument of Russian bots influencing the election. Overall, it demonstrates a very unusual concept of hate speech and how their terms of service apply. The bad news continues to roll out for Facebook this week, where a Verge article came out following an extensive investigation into content moderators. Content moderators are the people who work for Facebook and prevent things like racism, graphic violence, and child abuse from cropping up. They remove not only the content, but may engage in removing the accounts involved. The investigation found that some of this content is so horrible that the moderators wind up with PTSD, or at least PTSD-like symptoms. Others are becoming indoctrinated into conspiracies or conspiracy-like theories that they are responsible for policing and, if need be, removing it. It becomes rather difficult when you are exposed to it constantly. There are claims made that some of these moderators engage in drug abuse to cope, or in what they call trauma bonding, which involves sex in the workplace. This adds to last week's debacle, where Facebook was shown to be exposing pregnant women to targeted anti-vaxxer ads. Similarly, last week, YouTube was shown to be responsible for encouraging and increasing exposure to conspiracy theories. They appear to have taken that on board. YouTube claims to be stepping up actions to prevent what they call dangerous anti-vax content. Their method is rather straightforward. They are demonetizing videos associated with anti-vaxxers or anti-vax ideas. YouTube has finally decided that anti-vaccination videos are a violation of their terms of service on dangerous content, and particularly what they allow ads to appear on. This may be in response to the California Congressman Adam Schiff's letter sent to a number of tech companies in California last week, in which he expressed concern over the access to anti-vaxxer information. While large tech companies are finally beginning to accept the danger anti-vaxxers pose, the game developer has done something similar. Plague Inc., a game in which you simulate the spread of a disease, has added anti-vaxxers to their list of pathogens. The game was originally designed around the idea of epidemiology and the spread of disease. This included things like viruses, bacteria, and fungi. The new anti-vaxxer game scenario was only introduced this year. This may be in response to the public health crisis surrounding measles in America. The sad part is that whilst measles continues to become an issue in America, and is a public health crisis, representatives for their government believe that porn should be considered one as well. They appear to have their priorities backwards. State Representative for Arizona, Michelle Udall, believes that porn is a problem and that it is creating a public health crisis. She claimed as much before the lawmakers in their government body when trying to support the House concurrent resolution. Her belief is that pornography is used pervasively even by minors, and that this use will lead to an epidemic of health conditions. She claims there is a link to low self-esteem, eating disorders, an increase in problematic sexual activity, and more, although there is a lack of evidence to support these claims on her part. Udall will face a second problem if she attempts to censor access to pornography. Although there are legal barriers to accessing it from institutions like schools, there is a legal protection in the Constitution. Freedom of speech, as encapsulated by the Constitution, allows people to express themselves as they wish in this respect. This can include both accessing and providing pornography. Even if states were to attempt it, it's likely to go the same way the Pirate Bay did in the UK. While you have concern in Arizona that teens are accessing pornography You have another who is creating nuclear fission in their playroom. Jackson Oswald is a 14-year-old who claims to have successfully created a nuclear fusion reactor. He recently reported his success on the Fuso.net forum, and although it is yet to be verified through peer review, the other people on this forum agree that he has been successful.
Can I help you?
Sorry to bother you, ma'am. FBI. We're looking for a Sheldon Lee Cooper.
George?
I'm on the can.
Now?
What?
These gentlemen are with the FBI. They want to talk to Sheldon.
What? You fellas must have made a mistake. Sheldon's 9.
Well, someone living at this address recently called a mining operation in Canada and tried to buy uranium.
It is, however, nowhere near as cheap as porn would be, which many access for free. Oswald's reactor cost $10,000. This is not the only radioactive topic to have entered the news this week. An Arizona man was cremated after having been given a large dose of nuclear material to treat his tumor. 3 days before dying and being cremated, the man was given an incredibly large dose of lutetium-177 dotatate. This was still in his body when he was cremated. The problem with this is that cremation would normally destroy any medication in the body, along with many other byproducts of the destruction. Nuclear material, though, is far more resistant, and in this case resulted in the release of radiation. This resulted in a Geiger counter detecting substantially elevated levels of radiation in the crematorium. This leads into a wider issue. Every year, millions of Americans are diagnosed with cancer. Many of them are treated with nuclear therapy, and many of those still die. This means that when they are cremated, they are liable to create a public health issue by releasing that radiation back into the environment. This exposes crematorium workers and other cemetery staff to that radiation. While medical professionals do not believe that level of exposure by itself is a problem, it will add to other exposures. This means that it can substantially increase the risk from radiation. Adding to the list of things from last week that will make you go nope, there has been a rare fish found with no eyes, needle teeth, and rather resembles the alien chestbuster. This fish was of course found in Australia, the country that nobody wants to go to given the terrifying things found there. Anglers pulled up this 15-centimeter worm-like fish. After the National Broadcasting Corporation found out about this fish, they attempted to have it identified. The curator of fish at the State Museum and Art Gallery identified it as a worm goby. Although he wasn't able to identify the specifics, he said it was probably from the genus Taniodes. This is a species that feeds on crustaceans and small fish, and generally lives under the mud. Because of where they live and how they live, very little is known about them. The advice the curator gave was that despite their cruel appearance, they are unlikely to do much more than bite you. Adding to other examples of terrifying species, a giant tarantula was found dragging a possum away to devour it in the Amazon. Similar things have been seen in South America and Australia. There is a plethora of videos demonstrating these spiders feeding on snakes, mice, and birds on a regular basis. The paper that gave rise to this particular video points out that spiders are an underappreciated source of mortality, something that we really didn't need to know. Yet another nightmarish discovery is that of bacteria that eat parasitic worms from the inside out. The bacteria was called Golden Death. This bacterium is able to target nematodes that would normally disable them before they are consumed. This would mean that once they reach the stomach, they are unable to do any harm. This species is able to survive the process and then begins to feast. Going from the terrifying to bizarre, a man's blood turned so thick and white, it not only nearly killed him, but disables the equipment used to treat. A German man had a condition called Hypertriglyceridemia. This is a disease in which there are exceptionally high levels of fatty triglycerides in the blood. This is not an unusual disease and can normally be treated via plasmapheresis, in which the blood is extracted and filtered. The problem in this case was that the man in question had so much in his blood that the machine became clogged. This can be understood when you consider that 500 milligrams per deciliter of triglycerides in blood would be considered very high. He had 18,000 milligrams per deciliter. This condition eventually led to the man being in a coma that was just barely above a vegetative state. In order to treat him, they turned to a thoroughly discredited and almost universally ineffective treatment called bloodletting. This is also occasionally called blood leaching. They withdrew 2 liters of blood, replaced it with donor blood, plasma, and saline. This would normally be what's used to treat massive hemorrhaging or surgeries. This particularly unusual approach became necessary due to the patient's virtually unique conditions. This was a combination of obesity, diet, insulin resistance, and possibly genetic predisposition. Add to that he had diabetes medication which he didn't always take, and it was liable to end in disaster, which it almost did. Among other unusual treatments is that of the stem cell miracle cures. This treatment should immediately be questioned when it is touted by chiropractors. In one case study, a man received an injection into his back, which resulted in sepsis. A combination of E. coli and a second, less clearly identified bacteria nearly led to his death, and he was in hospital for 58 days. He and 17 other people have been hospitalized for the same reason. These injections resulted in an infection, which escalated. What's more, the companies responsible for producing these therapies are not regulated by the FDA, and the treatment is most certainly not approved. This means that they are, in effect, experimenting on people. The truly disturbing part of this is that the CDC and the FDA directly went to investigate. The company that was making the treatment claims that they initially thought the doctors implementing these treatments were not following the correct procedure, and that is what caused the infections. After the CDC obtained vials from either the facilities or the company itself, they found that 8 in 10 of the vials were contaminated before they had been opened by the medical facility. This is perhaps why stem cell therapy is largely seen as snake oil by medical professionals and researchers in the field. This story becomes even more convoluted and controversial as you begin looking at the details, particularly of the people behind the companies that are providing this treatment. This is not the only procedure this week that has wound up producing unexpected results. Another story came out about a butt implant. This implant led to a case of deadly blood cancer. These butt implants add to the body of evidence demonstrating that there may be an association with augmentation and an increased risk of cancer. In more positive news, scientists have genetically modified yeast to produce the psychoactive component of cannabis. This adds to work from the last few years in which yeast has produced opioids, and from even further back where yeast was used to produce anti-malarial agents. The upshot to this development is that yeast is relatively easy to maintain, produces very few byproducts that are undesirable, and, in the right circumstances, could drastically reduce the cost and processing requirements for THC and THCV. This would in turn make creating therapeutic dosing both easier and cheaper, which would reduce the cost for cannabis-based medication. This adds to other news about microbes this week. Another discovery involved the zombification of bacteria when they were beginning to starve. This appears to be a survival mechanism The process is similar to hibernation in multicellular organisms, in which the metabolic processes slow down to near nothing. In other microbiology-related news, a study has been published in which there is a link between antibiotic use in children and a risk of mental illness in adults. This used a large data set from the Danish Psychiatric Central Research Register. This tracked most of the medical information for children from 1995 onwards. It found that there may be an association between the use of antibiotics and a range of mental conditions. Although this is preliminary research, there is other evidence to back it up, and it may lead to more substantial findings in the future. In another unrelated study, scientists have taken a major step towards creating night vision through the use of nanotechnology. A study using mice found that they could effectively give night vision to them. At least in theory, this should work in a human just as well as it works in a mouse. The only downside is that you would need to be injected with the nanotech directly into your eye via a needle. This research coming out of the University of Science and Technology of China used nanoparticles that bind to both the rod and cone receptors in the eye. These can result in increased reception of longer wavelengths. This allows us to see beyond the near infrared. Even better again, the mice in this experiment did not lose their capacity to see in regular light. In another rather impressive bit of research, scientists have been able to record, and you can see for yourself, the movement from a single-celled algae into a multicellular organism. This work was spurred by the uncertainty as to why organisms would go from a single cell to multicellular. One theory involved the use of predators. Researchers from the George Institute of Technology and the University of Montana have explored just that. The work used a green algae. They then introduced a filter-feeding predator. What they found was that in 50 weeks, 2 out of the 5 experimental populations went from single-celled creatures into multicellular creatures. That is, that they demonstrated the de novo or novel origins of simple multicellular organisms. It is a very impressive example of evolutionary pressure and natural selection. More so when you realize that whilst for a human it is 50 weeks, for the algae it is 750 generations. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.